Hello and welcome to the webinar, Applying Negotiation and Contracting Skills Throughout the Sourcing Continuum. This is a great webinar for the beginning contract negotiator on the buy side or on the sales side. I'm JEANETTE Nyden. I'm the author of 3 books, several white papers, articles, etc. And I am a negotiation skills coach and trainer that specializes in working with contract professionals. All right, here's the negotiation paradox. Contracting and negotiating are critical competencies in this increasingly global economy, but I often find that companies are slow to invest in developing the competencies for more complex kinds of sourcing relationships. The key to your success is to understand the sourcing continuum, whether you're on the procurement side of the purchase or the sales side of the purchase, is to match the contracting and negotiating skills to the sourcing model. And I'll explain in a moment what that means. In order to master negotiating all along the sourcing continuum, you've got to have flexibility and agility and use different kinds of skills. Mastering a commodity contract and negotiate a commodity contract doesn't mean that you've mastered the skills needed for more complex sourcing approaches. So let's talk about what I mean by the sourcing continuum. Here's a visual aid for the sourcing continuum. Over here you've got the relationship axis. This is levels of interdependence. This axis is the contract, levels of complexity. Now, while you can have a relationship that has a high level of complexity with low levels of interdependence, think about buying very complex commodities, meaning components that are built offshore to the United States, but you're not very dependent on that particular supplier. You can have contractual complexity with little interdependence. But as you start to grow in terms of both complexity of the contract with the levels of interdependence that a buyer has with a supplier, you get increasingly different kinds of outcomes from that contractual relationship, and increasingly you as a contract admin need to use different kinds of skills, because up at the very top of this continuum are your most strategic relationships, and you cannot negotiate or contract a strategic relationship the same way that you would a more commoditized type of relationship. So here's another look at the sourcing continuum, where we have in the lower corner transactions. These are things that buyers can go to a 3 quotes and go quote-unquote type of model. I can, if I were a buyer at the transaction level, ask for a quote from a commodity supplier. There are simple purchase terms on the back of the purchase order, or maybe the supplier has its own terms that it attaches to an invoice, and there are low levels of interdependency, and the level of complexity is rather limited. And so as a result, if I get 3 qualified bids, I can choose one of those 3 qualified bids and purchase for my company. What I'm seeing in 2017 is that a lot of those sales are increasingly being affected by technology. And what that means is those kinds of purchases are being wrapped up into a master purchase agreement, and they're being automated for anywhere from 1 year to 3 years at a time, which leaves these next kinds of agreements for both buyers and suppliers to negotiate. Preferred suppliers with long-term agreements in effect. These are more interdependent and they are more complex. They're more interdependent because I may be limited to only 1 or 2 preferred suppliers. They're more complex because now I'm also contracting, in addition to price, certain kinds of outcome like delivery or parts per million in terms of manufacturing. For services, if I'm a preferred supplier and I'm augmenting labor, then I'm also saying that my staff is going to be qualified and will be available to work at certain dates and times. I will pass certain HR qualifications for the buyer. So as a result of the interdependency of being a preferred supplier, then I also have a greater contractual complexity. A strategic supplier is a risk-sharing agreement. Sometimes they're also sole suppliers, and the supplier shares in the buyer's risk. Now, these are incredibly interdependent relationships because we are sharing the risk between the buyer and the supplier as it relates to the end customer, whoever the user of the end product of this relationship is. So the risk sharing tends to reflect in liquidated damages for missed key performance indicators. There could be other kinds of indemnification provisions. There could be other kinds of provisions around safety, health, hazards, data protection, confidentiality of consumer information, etc. And as a result, it takes a very different kind of skill set to negotiate when you're also looking at sharing the risk with the supplier than if you were simply buying a commodity, even if it's a complex commodity, from another supplier. And then you've got the vested or risk and revenue sharing agreement. These are also called relational contracts by the International Association for Commercial and Contract Management. These relationships have both risk and revenue sharing components, and I've negotiated several of these vested types of relationships, and to be wildly successful, and I have several that are wildly successful, you really do have to have very collaborative negotiation skills to really balance the risk and revenue sharing agreement. One agreement that I've been brought into that was negotiated by someone else after a mere 2.5 years is being unwound as a result of not being able to get that risk and revenue sharing component correct in a highly collaborative seeming agreement between the buyer and the supplier. And then finally, at the very highest of outcomes is your equitable partner or joint venture. These are legally collaborative relationships. They are legal partnerships. And I want to thank Jackie Archer at DealWorks for coming up with the sourcing continuum and allowing me to use it. So what does this mean for you? What this means is as the parties become more interdependent, the fee for transaction model is augmented with exchanges of value. And I can explain a lot more about that in my books, the Vested Outsourcing Manual that I wrote with Kate Vitasic, and then Getting to We, that I talk about what it means to actually negotiate on value. And as you start looking at everything from preferred suppliers all the way up to a risk and revenue sharing agreement, such as a vested model, you are no longer buying an item, you are exchanging different kinds of value where the customer is also providing value to the supplier and the supplier is providing value to the customer, and that combined value improves the market share of both the supplier and the customer vis-a-vis third parties, end users, consumers, things like that. So here's another way to look at sourcing, and this is important, and again, this is from Jackie Archer, and I'd like you to look at this because we're going to talk about this again in a moment. For the contract type, I want you to pay attention to the bottom row, which is your impact to switch customer and supplier. If there's a commodity supplier, it's 3 quotes and a go, there's no impact to your company to switch a supplier. If a supplier doesn't have a nut or a bolt or that particular commodity, but 2 other suppliers do, you simply choose another supplier, provided that all things being equal, the commodity has the quality qualifications that you need. But when you're a preferred supplier, you can go all the way up to a medium impact to switch out that customer or that supplier. And that's where it becomes very critical as a negotiator, where the line of business has told me when I've gone in and done assessments of the contracting organizations, contracting professionals, particularly on buy side, are not aware that these preferred suppliers are actually difficult to switch out and that they could have long-term implications to end customer agreements. When you move to a strategic supplier where there's a long-term agreement, risk sharing, and MSA in place with an orientation towards performance, you have a very high impact to switch out a strategic supplier. There are often a lot of what we call idiosyncratic investments, meaning a supplier will invest in a customer's operations only in that particular way to that particular customer, and it's not something that can be leveraged in the market. When you get into an alliance partner and or a vested type of an agreement, it is a significant switch to impact, close to prohibitive. In one of the agreements that is being unwound, it is significant, and it will dramatically impact the customer to wind that particular alliance agreement down. And it's too bad that the math supports winding the agreement down rather than staying in the agreement. But many of the vested agreements, like I said, that I've personally negotiated, we are able to balance things in a way that they come up for renegotiation rather than being unwound. And then there is no switching out in an equitable partner. One partner simply sells its half of the business to the other or to some other third entity. Now, what I'd like you to do is think about mapping your deals. So when you get these slides from this presentation and you download them, I want you to think about where your deals are along the sourcing continuum, so that as you start to look at what the contracting outcomes are and what the negotiation skills are that are necessary to successfully negotiate these agreements on the buy side and on the sell side, you know where your deals map out on this kind of sourcing continuum. So let's look first at the contracting process, because it's different as you move along the sourcing continuum. So this is the traditional buyer process. This came from a contract text provided 2005, so it's many, many, many years old, through the National Contract Management Association. And while it's very accurate for commodity and simple preferred transactions with preferred suppliers, it fails. It starts to break down when you start looking at strategic suppliers, etc. So, your key inputs are your solicitation, your bid proposal, etc. What are the techniques, oral presentations by the seller, contract negotiators that are buyers, legal review, business case approval, etc. But really what I want you to look at is the desired output is to contract or walk away. That's no longer available when you are talking with strategic partners, and particularly with sole suppliers, where you may be renegotiating another option for 3 or 5 years with a particular supplier. You don't contract or walk away, you contract. Now this is the traditional seller's process, which looks fairly simple. And again, for commodity or for fairly simple preferred situations within the sourcing continuum, this could work. Oral presentations to the buyers, highly skilled sales reps that negotiate the agreements, they conduct the negotiations, they review the information, they identify contentious issues, etc. And again, contract or walk away. However, even with some preferred relationships, the pressure on the sales team is not to contract or walk away, it's to contract. So what would a contracting process look like for those relationships that are more impactful in a negative way to switch for either the seller or the buyer? So preferred relationships that are more difficult to switch, financially impactful to switch, all the way up to strategic partnerships, alliance partnerships, etc. So here's a different approach because it has a different goal. The goal is to establish a high-performing team with the supplier. So you develop the request for solution with the business unit. And again, this is a request for solution. Kate Fatasic also has some information out there for a request for partnership. These are very sophisticated tools, and they're not very difficult to use. They are incredibly enlightening for both the customer and the supplier because of the next stage, which is you interview suppliers on the buyer side, or you are interviewed on the sales side for your ability to solve problems. So when you're looking for a solution, you are looking at the supplier's ability to solve problems within your cultural environment, within the buyer's organization. How well does the solution fit your problem, and how well does the supplier's culture fit your culture? They can have the best solution in the world, but if the cultures are like oil and water, you're not going to have a high-performing team, and it could impact the result of the relationship and the outcome of the contract. Once you down-select your supplier, then you co-design the statement of work. So often the buyer would have some form of a statement of work in place. And I've co-designed these statements of work several times. One most recently over the summer with a strategic supplier because the customer's business division shifted its strategy dramatically. It divested a division. And so as a result, we had to, in the middle of contract negotiations on price, go back to the statement of work. And we were given permission on the buy side. I was helping to represent the buyer to collaboratively renegotiate the statement of work by the business unit. And it was a very, very fast process, which also then netted additional savings and a lot less adversarial than had we just reissued a new statement of work and asked them to price it. Once you've got the co-designed statement of work, then you look at your pricing model and you design it. You then formalize the contract and you transition the work. And you notice in this model, there is no contract or walk away, the assumption being you contract. And it's through the entire process from left to right that you are developing the kind of relationship with the customer or with the supplier that will dramatically impact the ability of that relationship to deliver on its goals. So now we need to think about what are the negotiating skills that you need along the sourcing continuum. So account teams that collaborated with their customers usually spent more time understanding the customer's business, had greater levels of customer respect, and had built strong internal relationships with key stakeholders at the customers. And this is from a quote from an IACCM study. But, oh goodness, the same study said 80% of negotiators polled said that they believe in win-win negotiations, but it was the other side that derails the process. Now, this was done in 2009, and it is the same today. Yesterday, the day before recording this webinar, I was the keynote speaker at an internal sales conference for an $8 billion company, and the vice president of sales was the morning speaker just before my address and said to the sales team this very idea about the other side. Who is this other side? Why do we demonize our customers and their buying process? Why are we not working more collaboratively with them? We have the superior product. We have the superior pricing. We have the market share. Why are we alienating our customers? And I found it very intriguing that she started this conference with this admonition that their customers are not actually the other side as an introduction to a keynote presentation on win-win negotiations. So who is this other side? If it's 80% of negotiators, that means 80% of the time they represent the other side to quote unquote the other side. So we've got to embrace collaborative negotiation skills. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like going back to your sourcing continuum rather, and you learning to negotiate risks and rewards. See, when you're in the commodity arena, you're negotiating on price. And maybe there's a couple simple terms around delivery dates and parts per million if you're in manufacturing, or if you're a commodity service provider, then it's sort of a shrink wrap license for software or something like that. So very simple terms and conditions. Price is usually the common denominator. But when you need to negotiate on risks and rewards, you've got complicated scorecards with very important key performance indicators, liquidated damages, all kinds of provisions around safety, data security, HR qualifications for augmented labor. Now you are negotiating risks and rewards, with the reward being potential bonuses if certain metrics are hit, and certain credits if certain metrics are not met. So your outcomes start to shift. And so as you can see, if you're still in a transaction mindset, but you're a preferred supplier relationship, whether you're the customer or the supplier, or you're a strategic supplier relationship on the customer side or the supplier side, and you're only focusing on price, you are actually doing your organization a disservice, because the outcome is actually negotiating and balancing the risks and rewards for your organization in order for it to perform. So what are the skills? What do they look like? So the skills are to extract value. I want the lowest possible price. And that's the 3 quotes in a go. So I want the lowest price, and I might choose a slightly higher price if I can get free delivery, because the delivery is baked into the quote-unquote price, the free delivery. I might choose a price based on not needing the delivery for 3 weeks, so I can choose the less expensive. So it really is driven around lowest possible price. When you go into the preferred supplier relationship, though, you're exchanging and claiming value. I want the lowest price and the fastest delivery. So in a commodity situation, I said, well, you could choose those things. But in a preferred supplier relationship, you're not choosing it, you're contracting for it. And that's the significant difference. In 3 quotes in a go, I can choose between 3 quotes. If I'm a preferred supplier, I am contracting for a set price for a particular kind of delivery schedule or a particular kind of key performance indicator around a physical item in manufacturing or the delivery of a service if I'm a service supplier. And that's incredibly important to know, that you are going into the relationship contracting. So you're exchanging and claiming value from each side of the relationship. When you are in strategic supplier relationships or alliance partnerships or even vested kinds of relationships, you're creating and claiming value. I want the best price for the service provider performance. This is a critical difference because you are jointly creating value where that value was not before in the market. This is why you have alliance partnerships. You go into a relationship to create a market advantage for the customer and ideally also for the supplier. So for the relationships that were vested that have been very successful, the supplier has been able to niche in a market, let's say banking for facilities management or logistics for perishable food from bakeries. And by aligning with a particular customer and creating this risk-reward relationship where they are creating value in their alliance, the logistics company or the facilities management company is getting something from the relationship in addition to what it's providing the customer. And it's not just the brand name, it's how the supplier operates is enhanced because of the innovations the supplier is making, the idiosyncratic investments that the supplier is making in the customer is actually improving the way the supplier operates. And then finally, you are doing creative value allocation at the very top, and that's in your equitable partnerships and perhaps even in some vested relationships that are fairly interdependent, where we are creating and sharing value from joint innovation. And so the One Finance Microsoft deal explains how Accenture and Microsoft were doing it when that deal was originally signed. That would be a great example of how you create value through innovation. They didn't, quote unquote, lift and shift when they outsourced. They actually co-innovated, which benefited both parties. If you want to know more about these skills and negotiating value, please buy a copy of Getting to We on Amazon. It has an entire chapter on this along with many other things that'll greatly go into depth around each of these kinds of negotiation skills. So here are the negotiation outcomes then, looking at it a little bit more precisely than a slide before. When you're in a transaction, it's a zero-sum game. When you're in a preferred supplier relationship, it's zero-sum plus some more simple T's and C's that are negotiated, as opposed to a purchase order or terms associated with an invoice that are typically not negotiated. When you get into a strategic alliance, you are defining performance standards, you've got clear service level agreements, you've got a governance mechanism in place and relationship management structure in place. And those are also negotiated. So not only are you negotiating risk and reward, but you're also now creating these outcomes, defined performance, service level agreements, governance matrix, etc. And when you get to the highest level of outcomes, you're defining the outcomes aligned with strategic goals for mutual performance. And so I've negotiated these mutual performance goals, and they are difficult to find because they do create the environment where the customers and the suppliers are working together and they are equally committed to the goal, so they are equally willing to be monitored by the relationship so that the customer is equally committed to reaching the innovative goal that the relationship has promised. So this is what it looks like in terms of how the skills are nested into one another. So for a commodity purchase, you're buying price and a little bit of value. Those are the skills that you need to understand. How do I differentiate one quote from another quote? If there's pushback on a purchase order term or on a supplier term, what do I do? How do I react to that? When you're a preferred vendor, you're buying price value and you're buying some performance. You're contracting for some level of performance. Now, there are multiple vendors, so there's lower risk with non-performance. But in one industry, even with multiple vendors, if there's a shortage of a raw commodity such as aluminum, as there was in the aerospace industry a couple of years ago, then all your preferred vendors start to perform poorly in the same way. Their deliveries are not on time, and the fact that you have 3 preferred vendors doesn't necessarily protect you from a commodity shortage. So you're still having that risk conversation internally with production, for example. Or if 2 preferred vendors merge in a service industry, one large mega giant scoops up another large company, now you may be into a single or sole provider relationship. So in a sole provider or single provider relationship, you're buying performance, and there's certainly much higher risks associated with non-performance. So you really are negotiating what that performance looks like and preventing the risk events from happening, or creating the structure when that risk event happens in your indemnification clauses, in your limitations of liability clauses, in your liquidated damages clauses, which you hope never have to be used, but if they are, they somehow mitigate the damage. And then your strategic relationships, which I'm categorizing all strategic relationships, alliance partners, etc., you're buying an outcome. So your negotiating and contracting skills are around an outcome. What is it that the strategic relationship or alliance partnership or vested agreement or even an equitable partner is looking to accomplish? And there are significant risks associated with non-performance, almost the kinds of risks that could really critically damage either the supplier or the buyer if that relationship fails. So as we said in the beginning, or as I said in the beginning rather, even if you've mastered a commodity purchase, you still have other skills that you need to master to negotiate preferred vendor relationships, single or sole provider relationships, and then all the range of strategic relationships. So I've got a lot of resources available on my website. I've got 2 white papers that help talk about these relationships that you might be interested in. Please feel free to go to my website, www.jnyden.com/free resources/articles to download your copies. Thank you.